Hello, hello. I'm Steffi. I'm Steffi Czerny, the founder of DLD. And as some of you know, DLD is obsessed in how technology, how digitalization is changing our world, our societies, our one-to-one with friends. Everything is changed by it. You know, I welcome you to today to this show, The Future of Virtual Worlds. As you know, we already shop virtual in virtual shopping malls. We go to the doctor in virtual calls. We, we have twins, digital twins. We perform medical procedures with the help of virtual reality. We do so many things already in the virtual world. To my guess, in 2020, it's only the beginning. Let's hear from two experts how the virtual world will impact our lives in the future. I'm very proud to welcome Herman Narula and Ben Vickers. Herman Narula is a good friend of DLD. 5 years ago, when he still was a boy, a childish boy, an obsessed boy with gaming, he was at DLD in Munich. I liked him so much then. And 5 years later, everything has changed, Herman. He is the co-founder of Improbable. His company, this young boy's company, received over 600 million US dollars in funding and is very well known in the gaming business with this platform Improbable. Improbable, it enables developers to build large-scale, complex simulations. Let me quote him. Building Better Worlds is the title. We at Improbable believe that multiplayer games are going to have a profound impact on the world. If you have played one recently, you will understand why. It's not just that they already captivate over 1 billion people. Imagine 1 billion people. It's also the fact that they are getting rapidly much more sophisticated. Today's games offer more than just battles and races. They offer profoundly meaningful experiences, new economic opportunities, and new ways to make genuine connections with one another. This is a very humanistic approach to games. And he will speak to a perfect fit interviewer, Ben Vickers. Ben Vickers, my good friend. He's a curator, a writer. He's the publisher of a fantastic new publishing house. Check it out, Ignota. And he's a technologist based in London. Ben is also the CTO at my favorite art temple. I call it a temple, but because you have to go to it. It's not a gallery. It's not a museum. It's much more. It's a devotion, and you have to go in it because when you want to see what the future is bringing us. Go to the Serpentine galleries in Kensington Gardens. Of course, Ben works very closely with the curator, Hans-Ulrich Oberst, my very good friend, my dear friend. He's curating the DLD art shows. He is more than a friend. I learned so much from him. Ben already curated a session around virtual worlds with Danish artist and art director Jacob Kudsteensen last January at DLD. And as my friends know, I always introduce these sessions with my feeling that artists are the seismographs, the sensitive seismographs of how society change along technologies and art. So Ben, I consider the perfect partner, sparring partner for today, for interview partner for Herman. I look forward to the follow-up today. Both Ben and Herman, welcome back to DLD Sync. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Steffi. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to the DLD team. So if anybody was skeptical at this point, I think there's a few statistics that are worth considering. with respect to video games. Since 2019, the games industry has been worth more than music and film combined. Current estimates of the global gaming population are 2.7 billion, which is around 35% the global population. And during this time of pandemic, where many of us haven't got to leave our homes for a long time, that's something that's only really accelerated. And it really feels to me today that we're kind of in this moment similar to when organizations and companies were first thinking about, should we be on social media? I think we're really at a moment in time where people should be considering, organizations, companies, which virtual worlds they want to participate in and contribute to. And there's really no one better to speak to that about than Herman Narula. So it's a real pleasure to have this conversation. And to start us off, Herman, I wanted to ask you, how did you come to this field? And what were the early experiences that you had in video games that led you to create Improbable, but also to set out this vast vision for the potential impact of video games?
So, I mean, I think me and my generation of gamers are probably the second or third wave. And for us, we didn't encounter games in the form of Pac-Man in an arcade. We were at a very young age immersed to these, involved with these beautiful immersive universes, which I think speak to you at a young age. And I know many people listening to this can relate to it. And I think what it did for me is it didn't just create a sense of wonder and excitement to play games online with other people. It also created a deep sense of frustration. Like in all of these worlds, there's this faraway city in the background that you can't go to. There are these limitations. There is this narrowness of who you can play with and what you can really do. And this profound implication that you're glimpsing this other world, but you can't get there. You're just peering at it through a keyhole. So I think for me, before any commercial impulse, any technical impulse, I think I had a deep desire to want to go to that Narnia, go to that other world. And I think that's what drew me into games and into technology. And then as a computer scientist, the revolution in both distributed systems and in cloud compute that just creates this fountain of ready computational power. That felt to me like the answer, like the way to finally realize those worlds. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a lot more complicated than that. And so it has taken us 8 long years of work and time. But I think we're now in a place where a lot of this can be realized. And I think, incidentally, when I was last at DLD, and since then this has only grown, it turns out the same technology, the same impulse that lets you create these worlds with a view for entertainment, I think it goes beyond that and lets you simulate parts of the real world. And we're already doing things like coronavirus models and defense work, which all seem to branch from that same evolutionary tree.
Yeah, I mean, I can only empathize. And I remember the first time that I encountered Spatial OS and was like totally obsessed with that potential, particularly because like as a teenager, I mean, I really didn't go to school. I just played Ultima Online for 7 years. And the potential for creating much more complex worlds that are stable and persistent and a higher grain detail, like instantly seems like the obvious kind of next step. And in many ways, it's like bizarre that we haven't got there yet. But there's many terms being, and I thought that'd be a good place to start. There's many terms that are being kind of thrown around at the moment in terms of what this will be. So whether it's artificial reality or MMOs, synthetic worlds, the metaverse is something that's gathered a lot of traction in the last couple of years, despite being a long historical term. But what does virtual world mean to you?
So for me, honestly, I'm quite skeptical of concepts like the metaverse, which might sound like a weird thing for me to say, but I always start from the position of what is the fundamental need something is fulfilling. So before we think about its future, what is the evolutionary pressure? And for me, this might seem controversial, but I don't think video games, particularly online games, are really entertainment as we know entertainment. I think what they are is an opportunity for people to have fulfilled some of the most elemental needs that we've ever studied in people. Through self-determination theory, we know that people want to feel competent, want to get better at something. They want autonomy and self-expression. They want meaningful relationships with other people. So I look at the role of games and worlds as providing people with environments in which those needs can be deeply fulfilled. And what's interesting is you cannot fake the fulfillment of those needs. I can't make you pretend to have a meaningful relationship. I mean, de facto, you are having one if you feel like you're having one. Similarly, if you're expressing yourself and being creative, you are. There's nothing artificial about that, nor is there about competence and understanding and modeling the world. So with that in mind, look, I definitely see these breakout virtual worlds becoming major forms of alternate reality in society in a really profoundly positive way for people. Now, the notion of a metaverse is, hey, let's connect them all together. I think that there's arguments for why there would definitely be shared services, but I think a lot of people are influenced by science fiction written in the 80s, Ready Player One, etc., in which virtual worlds were just a plot device, right? They were just there to sort of tell a story. I don't think reality will pan out that way at all. Much like how in the early .com boom, everybody thought it would be like real estate. You've got to have that .com. That's the key to the world. Clearly, nothing about the internet really worked out as being quite like how we imagined it to be.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get into the meaning and the detail of those worlds in a little bit, but I think for the audience, it would be useful to cover just a few kind of technical grounds, because I think that one of the things that if you're not involved in this and you're not building using video games engines, etc., that there's maybe not an awareness of what is actually happening in the industry right now, that video games engines specifically are becoming something that's used across industry, that they're being redeployed to different contexts. And it would be great to hear from you why you think that is, and what are the special affordances that come about as a result of using that versus, say, CAD software or the traditional platforms.
So, I mean, I think the previous sort of age of video games until about now has been focused on graphics. How do we make things as pretty as possible? And what emerged from that were game engines. And these are really powerful tools that, Unity and Unreal are examples of publicly well-known game engines that people can use to create interactive digital content. So you could create a room or a space with objects in it that are rendered beautifully that people can interact with and move around in. And that's been great for single player games or simple multiplayer games. But sort of the revolution that we're talking about is the creation of new technology, selfishly, technology like ours, which does more than just makes pretty graphics. It actually allows you to meaningfully simulate a huge chunk of artificial reality so that all those pretty pictures, they back onto a world that has tangible consequences, in which things can persist, in which rather than just 100 people or 200 people like you see now in digital concepts, you could have tens of thousands of people in the same environment at the same time. And I think what people don't always get is the importance and discontinuous value of scale. When you go from 10 people to 100 people to 1,000 people, the benefit is not merely additive. Just think about going to a football match when you have 50,000 people around you. It's a totally different experience to 5 people in a couch. It's not even comparable. There's something very primal, very human about that. So I think we've had the age of kind of pretty graphics. Now we're entering into the age of, okay, what more can you do for me? What sort of meaningful simulated world can you create? Why should I stay there? Which has also been part of a change in monetization as well. I think some of the audience may not be aware, some may, but like there's been a big push now towards games and worlds becoming free to access, with the long-term relationship you have with that world resulting in you investing money in things like owning items inside the world. And that in turn kind of provokes greater complexity.
That's great. And I think that one of the things that really kind of sets this path in my mind as being the way that it is going to go is because kind of simultaneous to the development of these technologies, we've also seen the maturity of things like artificial intelligence, which also are heavily indebted to video games because, during that first winter of AI, most of those people went and built video games and then went and built DeepMind and companies like it.
Good example.
But it's also things like blockchain companies as well, and the kinds of new network possibilities that are emerging from that. And I just wondered whether you had any specific thoughts on that kind of combination of different technologies accelerating.
Absolutely. Look, absolutely. And also connectivity is so important. You can't have complex online worlds without, cheap broadband that people have access to at scale. And, we're seeing that happen all over the world. And that growth in an online user base with good connections and good hardware is essential to enabling all of this. But to your point about AI, absolutely, modeling and building meaningful, interesting worlds isn't only about computational power. It's about understanding how to represent, compelling characters in that world, how to create interesting physics, how to model, anything that might result in that world coming to life. So the convergence of those technologies creates this sort of strange industrial revolution around virtual worlds. And that's certainly what we've noticed over the last couple of years.
And that kind of takes me on to the next question in terms of actually getting into the virtual worlds and not staying too much in the technology. You've spoken about the potential of these worlds to create new types of bonds, different ways of seeing ourselves, the opportunity to take on large-scale collaboration, essentially like the act of world building together. Can you speak to the qualities and the needs of these worlds in order for them to be more real than they are now?
Sure. I mean, I think before quite jumping to that, but you raised an interesting point about the value of them. Like, a good analogy, I think, a good way to think about it is think about the way people lived post the Dark Ages in kind of medieval Europe. So most people had access to very little information, maybe spoke one language, probably didn't travel very far from where they lived, probably didn't have access to much more in the form of stories, experiences, even the things they ate. If you were to compare our lives now to their lives then, there's a sort of intrinsic richness in our ability to imagine, to conceive, to think of things, because we're bombarded by so many new ideas and experiences. Like the kind of identities, individual identities we can have, the sort of preferences we can express in the world, they are larger, they're bigger. So I use the term multiversal self to represent what comes next, which you referenced there, the idea of important relationships forming in virtual worlds. But it's the idea of having multiple lives. So you could imagine looking back, 15, 20 years from now at people who didn't have that experience and go, wow, my life is so much richer. I have the real world and I have this other world in which I have a profession. And I have this world in which I can engage in these fascinating relationships that I find meaningful. So, to me, it's this discontinuous step of enriching kind of human life from one step to the other. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure I quite captured what you were asking there.
No, I mean, it does. It does to some extent. I guess it's also this question of like, what's currently missing.
Oh, sure.
And you've touched on this in a light way in terms of the scale of the worlds, the number of relationships that you can have. But how would it maybe if there are specific examples that you could give of like transforming worlds that already exist?
So there's sort of a backroom problem that isn't visible to people, and then a kind of front room problem that is. And I think I'll start with the front and kind of come to the back. I think in the front room problem, if you play any games, there's just enormous limitations in what you can do. There was a major concert in Fortnite, for example, that really only featured 100 people per instance of concert. That's not a concert. It was an amazing experience. But if you want to go and experience thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people, that isn't something that is currently out there. Similarly, the actual amount of computational power available to a given game or to a game developer to easily use is very limited. It's a bit like how in the early internet, you sort of had to build all of the website backend stuff yourself. And now, companies and startups can quickly just spin up on AWS, have access to all sorts of infrastructure and build web apps. None of that exists for the games industry. So game engines are really just on the front end. The back end is just this big, open, empty space. And it's kind of what Improbable has been building and working with developers to create. It's the idea of having the easy access to the power that goes beyond a single machine or a single device, to be able to do that. And the specific limitations you see in games as a result are generally online worlds are not persistent. Your actions don't matter. They don't propagate beyond the simple session you were playing. You can't have enough people to experience many kinds of complex value that can only happen with larger numbers of people. Even in the real world, right? Until a society reaches a certain size, you can't have division of labor. You can't have professions. You can't have cities. You can't have all of these cool things that genuinely require population size to sustain. So that limitation in gaming has limited the kinds of fun and the kinds of experiences people can have. The backroom problem, though, is just cost. Most online games are unbelievably expensive, hundreds of millions of dollars to build. And the rate of development of these games is so slow that you can't really react to user trends and needs and capabilities. One of the things we've tried to do is learn more from sort of the mobile space and from the web world and bring a kind of industrialization of online games online and sort of solve a lot of the problems so that developers can very cheaply and quickly build and innovate on these things. And industry-wide, that's what's needed to really have this Cambrian explosion of innovation in this space.
It's super interesting that you do frame it within that kind of the logic of civilizational development. But I just wanted to pull on something there and that I think is also worth highlighting in terms of the construction of worlds inside worlds. And we're just seeing the kind of explosion of games like Roblox. What do you think that transition in video games means, where people go from being a player? It's almost as if it's the same as like television to YouTube, where people went from watching something to then being a participant in creating content.
it's going to get super weird. One of the games we're developing internally, one of our most experimental projects, one of the notions we have is that players will have professions, like be paid to be like actors inside the game world. So with a ratio of about 1 to about 10,000, you could imagine a person playing a role that isn't done by AI, that's actually done by a human being at their computer, as a bartender or as an actor or a player inside this world. That's one example of players contributing. You mentioned another with games like Roblox, which basically dramatically simplify the world in order to make it easy for people to build content. Minecraft does something similar. But I'm envisioning a future where we could do all of that, but for more complex, visually appealing, and more sort of substantive games. If you could combine that with the ability for people to earn an income, which Roblox has pioneered massively, inside game worlds, either as the owner or runner of those worlds or as a professional contributor to them, then you can create self-sustaining economies inside these worlds. And so much interesting stuff starts to happen from that. I personally believe that a lot of disposable consumer spending, even things like fast fashion, the younger generation are going to be much more interested in expressing themselves in virtual worlds. Instead of buying a pair of jeans just to say something about yourself, you might buy a virtual item and actually help the environment in the wash.
I'm very curious on the kind of question of the economics, and I'm assuming that maybe you've looked at this in some ways, because as a teenager, I sold gold from a virtual world. And so it's been going on, a long time, like 20, 30 years or whatever. I'm curious, what do you think needs to happen, or what is the current economic analysis for somebody to be performing an action in a virtual world, like you said, a bartender or something like this? What kind of scale and what kind of economies need to be operating in that world, the point at which it kind of begins to reach parity with what you would be paid in an everyday job?
Well, that's actually an amazing question. And I think the answer really comes in the economics of free to play. So assuming that most online worlds will continue to take the model of being free for anyone to enter and you pay for extras, which has proven to be amazingly good economically, we see that a tiny fraction of players are responsible for the majority of spending in these game worlds. So let's just take some arbitrary numbers. Let's say 1%, 2% of people are responsible for 20, 30% of the revenue of the game. Well, then the role of everyone else in that game is to drive up that monetization by making that world more interesting in so many different ways. And I think what's required is, we already have games with hundreds of millions of people in them, but those games are not the same games that are perhaps built with enough scope and enough modern technology to really allow these types of self-expression. Most of these games are now actually quite old, again, due to the cost and prohibitive nature of building these things. So I think when we start to see the cost plummeting, some hits which end up, which is hard to predict, but hits that end up having vast numbers of players in them, and those games happening to have the same qualities of self-expression and investment, will begin to see these more modern economies forming inside game worlds. And this is also something that's curious and kind of unique about the games industry in some ways. People can be very ready for something, but it takes a particular game to sort of kick off the volcanic explosion of activity around that. Prior to games like Fortnite and Knives Out in China, there was an industry consensus that nobody was interested in playing a first-person shooter on their phone. Now, that's one of the biggest markets of that space. It's amazing how much revolution rather than evolution happens in this industry. Every game we just mentioned, Minecraft, Roblox, Fortnite, these were kind of outsiders. These weren't the big franchises at the times when they captured the public imagination.
Yeah, that's funny, because I still feel like I couldn't play a first-person shooter on my phone. But obviously, that maybe shows that I'm, the generation above now in terms of gaming. So one thing that I wanted to ask around this is that obviously we talked a little bit about the kind of technical complexity, and there's some problems to be solved. And I think we can broadly assume that we don't know the exact timeline, but most of these things will be solved. But it strikes me that what will happen at that stage is that the complexity will no longer be technical, and that the complexity will exist much more in the kind of stability of the worlds, the governance of the worlds. And if we take social media as an example, because if you think about social media early on, there were a lot of kind of big promises. In 2008, it was the aid to democracy. And now things have changed a little bit, a decade on.
Yeah, that hasn't aged well, that slogan.
But, and we have this kind of like post-fact society. And I wonder, are we going to get a kind of post-consensus reality society as we've got multiple worlds? And I just wondered, it's obviously a big question, but what do you think of the things that can be learned from social media, or what can be done now in order to kind of head off some of those issues going into the future?
So I think the most important difference in the two things, social media and virtual worlds, and it can superficially might even seem similar, but I think they're wildly different, is that the basic economics of social media are give me your attention so I can sell it to an advertiser. I don't care why you're paying attention, and I don't care what happens to you as a result or what your long-term relationship with me is. I just need you to pay attention. Virtual worlds have the exact opposite mechanics. What we are interested in is engagement. So what we're interested in is the long-term psychological fulfillment of needs over years of a player. There's no way to accomplish that without thinking in harmony about the well-being of your player base. There is no way to sort of exploitatively extract. That's more like gambling rather than virtual worlds and kind of long-term relationships. And one of the biggest problems with casinos is they destroy their customers, over a certain time frame. So in order to really fulfill psychological needs, you basically have to iterate towards games that provide people with deeply valuable relationships and experiences. I'll give you an example. One thing we know from online games is the faster you can make a friend inside a game world and have a meaningful relationship with them, the more likely you are to stay and to want to play. The other key element is competition. If you don't like the reality Facebook is presenting, or if you find that your experience on it is awful, where do you go? Nowhere. In the world of virtual worlds, you might be playing inside a society representing, medieval Europe for a day or two, and then you might decide, actually, I want to go into something more modern. And the ability to compete realities and worlds together forces, to a degree, better behavior in the way that these worlds operate, because their user base can leave. I'll give you an example. The real world economy, we often, wonder about inequality and how unfair it is that, wealth tends to accumulate. Most MMOs have a really interesting policy where they try to make it so that the richer or wealthier you become, you do not have disproportionate power over other players. Because if people felt like the economy was unfair, they'd just quit and go to a different world. That forces a totally different mindset around inequality. And I find that fascinating in the way that it functions.
Yeah, I don't know what it says about me, but I got very upset when Ultima Online changed the rules of its world in such a way that the 7 years I'd invested was equal to other players. So,
but it's amazing that they did. Can you imagine that happening in the real world? Can you imagine us going, you know what, we're going to take the top 100 richest people and, we're just going to even out things? No, of course not. But in gaming, the deep need for engagement, for your participation and your consensus and interest in the world, that provokes a different kind of behavior. And I think it'll also have a knock-on effect in the real world. I mean, I'll give you an example. I'm developing right now a framework to think about the level of psychological fulfillment that a game can bring. And what I noticed in doing that is you could apply this to a lot of real-world jobs. And you might end up finding that actually a lot of real-world jobs, for example, and I'll just name the example of being a warehouse fulfillment worker, for example, right? It doesn't provide you with the kind of autonomy, relatedness, and competence that even some games today bring you. And that kind of raises the question, as well as a minimum wage, should we have a sort of minimum threshold of interest that a job needs to provide before we consider it fit for human consumption?
There's a good question that's just come in from the audience that kind of touches on this. What are your biggest ethical and cultural concerns with the use of virtual worlds, and who defines the policies that govern users? So I think maybe to reframe that question a little bit, it's like, who will need to set down governance for these worlds going into the future? Because currently it's just games. But yes, what are your biggest concerns at a kind of cultural level?
So I think, for me, I step back from the technology question and ask and look at the real world and look at analogies. And I think building virtual worlds, building stories in which we live is something we've done as a society as far back as we've had society. Whether you include mythologies, religions, social structures, sport even, is basically a virtual world that we've created that we imbue with meaning in different forms. And if you're an Arsenal fan, you imbue it with a lot of meaning lately. But still, the point is, this isn't new. The notion of consensus-based reality is something we've had for a long time. I think ethically and culturally, the most important thing is to incentivize the kind of economic activity that works towards psychological needs fulfillment. And self-determination theory is 30 years old. And along with other branches of psychology, it gives us tons of clinical evidence about what is and is not going to fulfill those needs. And I think we should make policies that drive that rather than allow for things like gambling and exploitative short-term relationships with content that really are a waste of time and energy, and frankly, not even that interesting economically over the long term. In terms of who decides what are these policies, the beautiful thing about games and virtual worlds is that they come and go. They do have durability, but there are new games, new worlds, much like there are new trends in music. It's not like social media where a single company will end up controlling everything. There's and invariably going to be a number of large virtual worlds which kind of work between them. I personally favor users being participants in the process of forming policies for these types of worlds in a somewhat democratic way, because it drives their engagement and their adoption. And games that have adopted this type of approach have had a lot of success when it's been done carefully.
That's a good answer. There's also another question that kind of cuts through a question that I wanted to ask in terms of the kind of touching on your point in terms of self-determination and self-fulfillment. Why is it within the games industry that there hasn't been this kind of bringing in of all of this kind of awareness around psychoanalysis? There are all these fields that have been focused on the kind of betterment of the individual and understanding yourself, and that's not always a good thing, right? Like you have to go for a dark night of the soul before you get to the good stuff. But I wondered, firstly, why do you think the games industry hasn't necessarily taken that on? And then specific to this question that's come in from the audience, where it says, what will be the implications in terms of mental shift in worldview, emotional attitude, and specifically inner relationships? So when they become virtual.
Brilliant. That's a brilliant question. I guess there's two sort of questions there. The first on why not now? The technology, the capability, and the market size just hasn't been there to really drive this type of investment and interest in this market and in this field. I think this is all changing very fast. We're hardly the only people who are thinking about these problems this way, and you can see this already entering into different games companies and groups. There is a bit of an innovator's dilemma. I mean, if you've been shipping a big franchise game year after year, the new opportunities that virtual worlds represent are really a rewrite of your business model and a rewrite of the way that you've been using technology. So I think we're going to see the kind of disruption that results in new companies rising up and seizing this sort of new industry. And we're also going to see a lot of change in the way that the games industry is structured right now. It's currently the result of a lot of big mergers, particularly in the West, with a few big holding companies that own a lot of franchise content and IP. But we're seeing that being violently disrupted by new upstart companies that are using more egalitarian distribution channels to sort of build revenue and market. So we're kind of having the sort of the kind of clash of titans right now. And I think over the next year or two, things will stabilize. The good news for those that don't like tech overreach is, to date, it doesn't seem like the big tech companies are particularly good at applying their hand at content. Maybe Microsoft is an exception, but Amazon and Google have struggled to land a blow here yet. And I think part of that is because their business models are just so very different from what this industry requires. In terms of what will be the shifts in the worldview, well, Ben, I know we both share a passion for meditation, and I know we both share a passion for the notion of people going through personal journeys, which ultimately result in them being happier. And what those journeys tend to involve are experiences, right? We all treasure the most meaningful experiences in our lives, those losses, those gains, those moments when we believed we could do something that we didn't know we could do. What games offer is, and what these games will offer, is another stage on which to have those experiences. Those experiences are just as real for the individual and have just the same transformative potential. Loads of people have gotten married in World of Warcraft. It was weird before, but now so many relationships are formed online in Tinder and beyond. It's a bit of a game now in the way that it functions. So I see games as being a tool for self-discovery. And I think that they're going to set a lot of people on journeys, especially people whose real life circumstances and situations have never let them encounter these experiences, right? That I think will kind of grow things. I also want to talk about the notion of relationships. The last place on the planet where rich or poor, regardless of your race, regardless of your gender, regardless of even where you're from, you can have a truly equal interaction with someone is probably the matchmaking queue of a video game. At this moment in time, statistically, there are people who are enemies on opposite sides of an armed conflict who've probably match-made together in the same game on the same team. They might even be on voice chat without realizing this today. So I'm reminded a lot of the sort of winter miracle in World War I and people playing football together and ceasing fire. And I think games have the potential to build just profound and tremendous empathy between people, because they force you to collaborate, they force you to work together in a way that social media doesn't. It's just a giant argument. There's no real need to reconcile. So I hope that kind of goes some way to answering why I'm optimistic about it.
Yeah, I mean, we could stay on the inner world of video games for a long time, but I think it's good to cover a lot of different subjects. But so to go a little bit outside of that, but to kind of stay on the historical thread, I was thinking a lot of the weekend about the role of coffee houses and the way they, as a third place, really had an unexpected impact on society. A lot of the early formation of the stock exchange, education, university, etc. But those things, they were performed in that space, but they kind of left that space and they transformed society. And I wondered whether you'd given much thought in terms of people go into these virtual worlds as a third place. What comes out of it? How do they potentially begin to change the world?
So, I mean, I'm very interested in the notion of the guild, which you'll know from Ultima Online, or the faction, or the group, or the clan, the loose association of 50 to 100, sometimes more people who play something together and solve puzzles and challenges together in that game. What's interesting about these groups is they tend to be very wide in age spread, gender spread, depending upon the game, again, culture, racial background, etc. And these groups tend to, when they're long-lived, become real-life relationship sets as well. And there isn't really anything like that we have access to today. You have your work colleagues, I guess, you have your extended friendship group and maybe people you meet at school, but the idea of being mixed together with a group like that, not one intimate relationship, but really a village. And then that village essentially learning how to solve problems and puzzles together, learning how to communicate together, learning how to share resources together. I could see a future where, guilds and groups formed in virtual worlds become important in the real world, become, a tool in the real world for organization and for clarity and for, like coffee houses in the way that they function. But again, to do that, we have to feed the engine of these worlds with the raw material to present interesting enough experiences that this actually happens and evolves. And we're not quite there yet.
Okay, I'm going to jump to another question that very much relates to this. So the other week, I was speaking to Andy Norgren, who's that was previously the executive producer for EVE Online, which
cool.
people don't know is like one of the biggest worlds, one of the most complex worlds. Essentially, it's free market capitalism in space. Is the short way of explaining it. But one of the things that she highlighted to me was the issue of governance and how complex that can become in a world that takes on parity of value with this world. And I wondered whether you've given that much thought in terms of like how are these worlds going to be governed in the future? You mentioned that you prefer for it to be more player orientated, and certainly players have enormous agency, but the issue of governance in these worlds and its overlap.
It's a great question. I mean, look, EVE Online has an economist. I think they actually for a while had I think Valve had the economist from who was finance minister of Greece. I think one of these companies did. Like, once you start dealing with groups of human beings in a social setting, exchanging information and ideas, challenging each other, sharing resources, all of the same universal constructs that we've encountered in the real world need to be tackled inside the game world. How do you create stable politics? How do you create a stable economy? How do you create a notion of fairness? So I think increasingly the companies that sort of govern virtual worlds are going to start looking to real life governance as guidance, and perhaps vice versa. Maybe the rapid development of societies in virtual worlds will become an interesting way of prototyping and creating consensus around policies in the real world as well. We take the issue of healthcare, for example, which is extremely controversial in the States and elsewhere, where people have very locked in views about what will and will not work. I could envision a future in which having seen a policy or an idea or its analogy, maybe a way of organizing or a way of paying for something, work well in a virtual world, a voter base might be more open-minded to accepting it in the real world. There's really no end to the mixing between these two. We should stop seeing this as gaming or entertainment at all, and just more life, just another space in which to live out our lives and engage and be more human.
So I think for anyone that's kind of involved themselves, or anybody during pandemic that started playing Animal Crossing or something, they would be totally convinced at this point that, this is a surrogate more life. But there will definitely be people that are more skeptical. And I think that one of the common things that people level at this, the idea of creating kind of other realities of sort of fantasy worlds in a moment in which, there are some pretty serious global crises, whether it's climate change, whether it's pandemic flu, the list goes on. We're in a very, very unstable moment in time. And I know that you've been working with simulations, but it would be great to hear a little bit about the kind of secondary affordances of generating games and what that means for those problems.
So a few weeks ago, we announced a coronavirus model in the UK that is 10,000 times faster than the fastest model that's currently in use. It predicted a second wave, and it was used in all kinds of interesting ways. Recently by academics, we just sort of supplied the underlying tech. But that was a great example of how a model built from technology that originates in gaming can then be used in other contexts as well. Similarly, we work on large-scale defense simulations, so modeling an entire country and then running big training simulations inside that country that could involve thousands of real-world participants. That's powerful. There are so many instances of large-scale cooperation which require constant rehearsal, constant adaptation. And in our current world, things move so quickly. You can't just have a stock plan, lying on a shelf. You have to quickly improvise and come up with a new plan. Being able to run a virtual world or simulation or experiment inside a gaming world is a very powerful way to test things, try things before they happen in the real world. It's really it's a sister technology to AI and machine learning, and an important component in the bigger way in which we model our reality. But I'd also say, look, consumer behavior, like a lot of the things that we like to do, meeting each other in the real world, buying goods and services, which, don't necessarily have a lot of long-term tangible value to us. Think of just buying certain kinds of toys for children, right? If even a small percentage of that spending became virtual, that's powerful for the environment. That's powerful for the efficiency of our society. That's powerful even for the equality and accessibility of these things in our society, because it's much easier to create fairness in this context. So I look at virtual worlds not as a replacement of the real world in this most pressing time, but a really important tool in building a new kind of world and society, one in which everybody has access to meaningful work, everybody has an education and new experiences and an ability to form meaningful relationships. All of that is possible if we can embrace what this technology can do. In many ways, this was the promise of the original work on the internet, but it didn't work out that way. Things became much more centralized. I think gaming has the potential to be very different, given the underlying economics of it.
And to kind of throw in the other kind of standard thing that people often criticize games for, a lot of people will say, well, games are violent. And to be fair, if you look at the top 100 games over the last decade, there's a lot of violent games in there. So I'm curious, not to address the issue of violence in video games, but what do you think is required to kind of move the needle that we start to see the emergence of different kinds of games? Like in my work at the Serpentine, we use video games engines and we produce very different things working with artists. But I was curious, where, and also from a practical operational perspective, what type of investment needs to emerge? What kinds of models need to come into being so that we start to get a kind of much more plural set of games?
So, comprehensive research, over decades, has totally dispelled any notion that games in any way make people violent. In fact, kind of the opposite seems to be true. I think society has this strange cognitive dissonance around things like this. It's the same way in which, societies that restrict pornography find they actually have higher incidences of, sexual violence and crimes and other things of that nature. I think the notion of us doing things in our imagination or in virtual worlds that we clearly know we wouldn't and shouldn't do in the real world, but that are important for us, that's a part of everyone's life. We all dream. We all have dreams that contain all manner of things in them that we probably wouldn't do in the real world. So I think the human mind needs that opportunity to dream, to experiment, to do different things. And I think people have shown that they can quite robustly separate violence they see in movies or music or other things from the real world. And there's usually a moral panic around this. Every time something new comes out, it's kind of funny because you can trace it all the way back. Sure, with games, there's that. With movies, there was the panic around whether this will influence people the wrong way. With the novel, there was the original emergence of the novel in Western society. There was a view that it would, have a corrupting influence on people. As far back as ancient Egyptian myth, you can see stories in which writing is considered to corrupt people because it'll mess up our memories and take us away from the real world. So
it did,
right? So we have this weird relationship with every new mental medium that we create, the strange anxiety that it'll either become a prosthetic that'll cause our faculties to wither, or it'll take us away from that which is moral, that which is important. But consistently, that's not been the case. Now, that doesn't mean there can't be unhealthy relationships with this content. Don't get me wrong. That inevitably is something that can occur. But it does give us some confidence that the basic notion of this medium isn't in any way negative. And in fact, I think there was a recent bunch of studies done by Oxford that showed that video game usage results in increased happiness. And if we take self-determination theory, we know that if people don't feel they can grow in competence, in relatedness and autonomy, if they don't have that opportunity in their lives, whether through games or something else, their development is stunted. Their happiness and self-actualization is stunted. We need more than food to live. We need these amazing experiences. And I think games are one way in which we can provide that.
Just to pull this is kind of anachronistic question, but I want to ask it because it's curious. Is the future of virtual worlds purely game engine based?
I mean, we're getting into the technology of this. I actually have a mischievous view that the game engine is sort of dead. I think that the game engine is a bit of an all-in-one tool to run a game on a single machine. If we look at the analogy of the way the web works, there are so many different services and processes that all interact together and run on separate machines and are built in different ways. I could see a different tool for administering a virtual world, a different tool for building art and assets, a different tool for running and managing the complex backend simulation. The way we're approaching things as Improbable is we plug into game engines, but we're increasingly seeing more and more computation leave them and run on the server side and on the back end. If people have been following cloud gaming, the idea of just streaming video down to a player machine, that's also going to be a component in realizing this future.
Okay, I'll throw another technical question from the audience before returning to the thread that we were on. What is your take on how the interface of human to virtual avatar in a virtual world needs to evolve? VR hardware is still far from mainstream, so what needs to change to get this to the mainstream?
So my controversial opinion is we need absolutely no new hardware and no more immersion than we currently have to realize everything we've just been talking about. It doesn't seem that graphical fidelity is that important to have meaningful experiences inside a game beyond the level we've already reached. And there's good anecdotal evidence for this. If you've ever read a novel, you feel like you're there. Would it be better if there were pictures? I mean, the fact that there are movies doesn't take away from novels. Human beings already have an innate kind of ability to concentrate and conjure reality and images on the things that we focus on. So I'm not convinced that VR hardware is necessary. However, the immersive power of that hardware when it is finally ready will only redouble the kind of investment and interest in this space that we're talking about, because it can be very thrilling and add a lot more hedonic pleasure to be physically immersed in a space. I also think it presents interesting opportunities to feel and do physical activity inside virtual worlds. The potential for gyms with VR, or for, imagine a global marathon being run by millions of people all at home on treadmills in VR, but inside a virtual space together. There's some really amazing things that become possible when you have that hardware, but it's not at all necessary. Nothing in this talk should be seen as being about really VR in particular.
Yeah, agreed. And in some ways, it's like stunning that during the pandemic, somebody hasn't released a video game that like plugs into your treadmill or something like this, because it seems to me that would be the kind of Animal Crossing that we need for this wave.
As I said that, I'm like, I really hope someone does that. So yeah.
Yeah. But to kind of return to the thread of, so if people have been listening to this and they're convinced that kind of virtual worlds are going to be a major kind of transition stone, and they're perhaps in different professions or different areas. Facebook has politicians, Magic Leap has had Neil Stephenson. I'm curious, at this stage, what are the professions and practices that are needed most in this like early formation stage?
Psychologists. We need more psychologists. We need clinical psychologists. We need experimental psychologists. We need people who are good at performing great experiments that can help us determine how fulfilling games content really is. And we need artists, creatives. We need visionaries who can present views of the world that go beyond the kind of adolescent, teenage boy game worlds of the 90s into something which I love, I have to say, but into things that are more compelling. We need to see more diverse voices inside gaming as well. I want to play a vision of a world that's full of the cultural expanse of humanity, not just centered around a few themes that get repeated again and again and again. I think we need the entire creative establishment to start to look at games not as a third-class citizen in which their ideas eventually find themselves, but as a primary way of engaging with their audience and of coming up with ideas. Like, I see a world in which movies are made about experiences in games. I think games are that primary medium. But look, I mean, you raise an interesting point here about the notion of a movement or about investment in this space. Today, the biggest public promise of technology that everyone is sort of waiting for and dreaming of is AI, the notion that we're going to make entities that are as intelligent as we are. And that's incredibly dystopian for human beings. Like, our lives don't sound that great in that future. I think virtual worlds and their end game, which is, hey, we've commoditized reality itself. Any experience you want to have or could have, the holodeck in Star Trek is a great example. Making that real feels like an incredibly beyond any economic reason to do so, as something that genuinely creates an improvement in quality of life. That I think is something that I hope more people are inspired to engage with and to be involved in games to make happen.
That makes sense. And in terms of people crossing over from those types of industries into this space, what do you think are the kind of major barriers that are present right now for that kind of transition? Do you think the barriers are the culture of games? Is it a technical issue? Is it a financial issue?
Right now, honestly, it's just knowledge. I just don't think. I think in the last 2 years or so, gaming has become the perfect place for new entrants to kind of come and get involved. Investors have become more savvy and more willing to take risks in the space. Companies like us have built infrastructure that people can now start to use. If I were personally getting started in one of those professions and interested in this space, now would be the absolute time to jump ship. In the same way that in 2008, we saw people, with the financial crisis, start new businesses, do new things, leave finance in some ways. I think coronavirus and the pandemic has surely shown us that there's tremendous value now in realizing virtual worlds. The generation pandemic, who can't go to live concerts, who can't experience these things, they're ready to spend and they're ready to participate in these worlds, for the first time in a big way.
Okay. And there's a question from the audience here to a degree of skepticism. If we see virtual worlds as rehearsals, doesn't that conflict with seeing them as meaningful?
I mean, not to get too philosophical, but dreams aren't real, but they're still meaningful, right? Imagined experience or created experience. I think different worlds will play different roles for different people at different times. A military simulation is very clearly rehearsal, but then a game like EVE Online, that's happening live, that's real. Consequences matter inside that virtual world. You only get one go. I think it's merely about how one configures and uses a given virtual world for a given purpose. So both can be true.
I think one of the things that's really worth kind of grounding here is what this transition of media means. And you've talked about agency. And I think that that's one of the things that's kind of missed in terms of particularly the way in which many people have approached social media from a kind of organizational perspective, that it's become this like secondary broadcast medium, and everybody wants to produce kind of viral content, but that requires participation. That's really hard, and it's not been well learned by institutions. So in a way, individuals have become their own institutions. And I think it would be interesting to hear from you in terms of a little bit about how you see that ecosystem playing out, like, Twitch, etc.
Sure.
Like, just paint a picture of that.
So watching stories unfold inside games through streaming like Twitch and YouTube has become a gigantic industry. Twitch was bought for a few $1 billion by Amazon several years ago, and probably is worth more than that, much more than that now. It seems like discovering content in games by watching other people play, including your friends, is the primary and best medium for discovery in gaming. So that change, it's quite healthy actually, because you can't really fake that, and so people tend to buy into products that are genuinely good and stay with them. But I think that creates an entirely new class of connectors who are, famous players of games, who are either humorous or tell interesting stories or that you might encounter. But I think the difference between them and celebrity in other fields is you really can play with them, you can participate with them, you can engage with them. And I think that's going to create a much healthier, relationship, because a lot of these social media 3.0 stars in gaming are inevitably going to be a lot more human and a lot more responsive and interactive than we've seen in the past. And they're also, I think the other important thing to think about here is, as we think of, as you mentioned, the rush to build viral content on social media, it's so deceptive. In some ways, I find the universe created and presented in social media much faker than the world of a game. In World of Warcraft or in EVE Online or in any game, what's happening is really happening. You're encountering a sort of consistent truth inside that world. You know who won or who lost a particular game. You can't fake it. You know what you're doing and where you stand. Social media is all about making you miserable through a deceptive view of the world where everyone else is having a party you're not involved in. Games are the exact opposite. You're involved, you're there, you're participating. It's your memory, and you have an equal right to be there, not because of who you are in the real world, but because of your performance in that one. And I think that can be a source of a lot of hope to people as well.
So we're coming up to time. I've had a lot of different questions, but I'm aware that this field is vast and your thinking on it is very, very broad. do you feel as though there are areas that we haven't covered, or there are things that you feel that are really important to state?
I think it's interesting to think about the far future. Like, I'm conscious that we've taken the audience, I think, along with us till now. Even the most skeptical among you are like, okay, you're talking about stuff that could be useful to people. You're making a sort of economic and psychological argument. There's evidence, fine. So I'm going to indulge, if that's okay, Ben, just for a few minutes to think about the far future and to sort of wonder what this means for society. You might go as far as to say, hey, maybe this is what species do. They get to a stage where they start building such massive simulations, such tremendous and enormous virtual worlds that they can fully inhabit inside, that, you know, it becomes beyond our current comprehension in terms of how compelling and how wondrous that could be. You know, we could possibly live out lives, you know, in our past or in our future, or we could live out branching realities. We could probably create home for billions more people than our planet can support, if we had access to this type of technology and this type of scale. And maybe, you know, I'm a big fan of, you know, space travel and Fermi paradox and, you know, where are all the aliens? Maybe that's where they are. You know, maybe there's a lot more reality out there that we haven't even encountered yet. So I think going as far back as the first time a human being started engaging in agriculture, we've been transforming the world around us to make it better for us to live. This is just a continuation of that. You know, this is just wholly crafting reality with a view to generating something interesting for human beings.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because I think that one of the, you know, you've talked about this kind of tipping point where it sort of just happens and suddenly it's in front of you. And I think that there is historical, I'm not going to say it's definitely this, but there's certainly historical precedent for technologies coming into being that totally transform the reality around us. And I think that language and writing is like a great example of that. I wonder whether simulation will also be that, because it creates a very strange kind of space in which not only you can participate, but also you can kind of observe and create.
I think education will be one of the most disruptive things. I say this with our work in military planning, but we're seeing this incredible, I mean, without kind of going into too much detail, you know, working with sort of NATO, the US and the UK, but we're starting to see this incredible effect that happens when people can play with a model, where they start to gain an intuition of things, of how things could be. You know, it doesn't replace real world experience, but it's better than no experience. It starts to give you an intuition, you know, for a problem domain. An example is we did some work, and this is outside of the military space, but looking at modeling power grids for electric vehicles. And we were very quickly able to see that actually the way these things operate when you play with them isn't how people expected them to be. And there are limitations and vulnerabilities in power grids that need to be addressed. You know, human beings are better at play and modeling and imagining than we are at numbers and spreadsheets. So this could become, as you say, a new language, a new way for us to persuade one another, convey ideas, consider options. You know, and I'm very excited to sort of see that happen, make that happen, hopefully.
There's a book that feels relevant by Herman Hesse called The Glass Bead Game, in which there's a moment where mathematics and music merge to produce an entirely new cultural form. I think it's particularly relevant to what you just described and the kind of potential that's coming into the future. But I'm conscious that we're at time. So thank you, everybody, for watching the talk. Thank you, Herman, for the conversation. And thank you, Steffi and DLD, for having us.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Herman. I'm so excited. You know, with my 66 years, you really opened my mind into a new field. I want to get deeper into it. You really made my day, not only my day, you both in your conversation triggered my nerves, triggered everything, because I see there is so much in it. There is so much we didn't discover it yet. And Herman, you're really a pioneer of this. And I'm very proud that both of you have been made the last hour so very fruitful. Thank you. It's only the beginning, I said in the beginning. And it's the beginning of a new world for me, and a new world, I hope, for you, dear audience. And thank you so much, especially, and this I think is the best, for the humanistic approach you gave us towards games. I think this is important that we get this, that it's an important tool for humanity. I never thought about games about this, but now I'm starting to do this. Thank you so much.
Thank
It
you
was
all.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.